everybody for coming out to our once monthly speaker series for the philosophy department, although we clearly have managed to spread the word to some other places this time. Today our guest is Elric Elias. He's a fourth-year PhD candidate in the psychology department at the University of Denver. His research is on visual perception and visual awareness. He's published on how the visual system perceives groups, as well as how subjectively invisible objects, attention, and visual awareness interact. He has an interest in how the brain accomplishes conscious awareness. So like Christoph Koch, you're still figuring that out. I met Elric in the spring, and he was reaching out to do some interdisciplinary work. I'm a philosopher, he's a neuroscientist, and so I invited him to come give a talk in my philosophy and psychology seminar in the summer, and it was so well received that I couldn't wait to get him back here to do a talk for the bigger group. So I know you'll enjoy yourself. Elric, you want to start up?
Hi guys, so thanks so much for coming. It's really great to see a lot of people here. Like Cam just said, my name is Elric Elias. I am a PhD candidate in the psychology department over at the University of Denver. I do cognitive neuroscience. My big interest is consciousness. I study and publish on visual perception in general, but I mean the real reason I do this stuff is because I'm obsessed with consciousness. I study the human brain, but humans are animals, of course, so along the way I've learned a lot about the non-human brain as well. And hopefully there's going to be a lot of information in this talk, and we're going to move pretty quick, but hopefully something will be useful, or at least fire up your imagination. So to start with, what does this topic matter? It's a question that I get asked surprisingly often, is who cares? What does this matter? And a lot of times, honestly, I don't know how to answer that question because it seems so obvious to me, but so the internal subjective experiences of some organism or object only matter if that organism or object has internal or subjective experiences. If it doesn't have any, toaster doesn't have any, we don't bother ourselves with what the conscious experiences of a toaster are like. But if a conscious organism does have something, some kind of internal subjective conscious experiences, like a grandmother probably does, all of a sudden it matters a lot more. And the ability to hypothetically, we can't yet, but the ability to hypothetically to determine the presence or absence of consciousness in any given organism is obviously important. People wring their hands over what to do with coma patients and things like this. So the question in principle is pretty obviously important. And then more my speed on just a big level, I don't know. This isn't going to give me any grants, but really, I mean, humans have always found themselves asking, what am I? What is this? And answering that question may entail asking other species, who are you? So really, that's the big reason I care. So what is consciousness anyway? This is a hard and complicated question, like I'm sure a lot of the people who do philosophy are well aware. I don't know the answer to it. I don't think anybody does. How does it work? How does the brain accomplish consciousness? Again, a very difficult, huge question. Nobody knows the answer. So instead, sometimes people ask, rather than what is consciousness, just what is it? Give me like a workable definition. Sometimes instead people ask, when is something conscious? Like I said, again, we don't know how to determine that for sure, but some philosophers have suggested that some organism or some object is conscious when there is something it is like to be that thing. So a toaster is not conscious. What is it like to be a toaster? It's not like anything. There's nothing it's like to be one of those things. Your grandmother, there's something it's like to be your grandmother. She is conscious in this sense. But even that question is really difficult. Our main question here today is, are non-human animals conscious? Let's say we wanted to answer that question. You might think a good starting point is, hey, humans are conscious. Well, that's really difficult to determine in and of itself. I promise it's really hard to show unambiguously that a normal, functioning, awake human being is conscious. Even that is really difficult. So I suggest, how about we break the question down, make it something a little more tractable. Instead of, is organism X, Y, or Z conscious, we can ask, do non-humans, in this case, do non-human animals have conscious experiences of any kind? If they have a conscious experience of some kind, this goes for humans too, of course, if some animal or some object has a conscious experience of any kind, then presumably in some sense that object or organism is conscious. I'm going to ruin my own party and tell you guys the answer, and the answer is that no one knows for certain. That is the strict technical answer. To be fair though, this answer applies equally well to humans. If you were to ask yourself, am I conscious? This is the strict answer to that question as well. So the limitedness of that answer doesn't apply to just non-humans, it applies to humans as well. So right now, I don't know what you're thinking or feeling, hopefully it's not too bad yet, but whatever it is, I want you to imagine if somehow you could get a view inside your brain, what would you see? Would you see a little tiny you having thoughts and feelings? Would you see some ghostly blob of thoughts and feelings? Of course you wouldn't see any of that, it's rhetorical. Everyone knows better. What you would see is this.
Cool.
And that's it. Nothing else. That's all you would see. I mean, there's other stuff in there, there's blood and goo and all that stuff, but the heavy lifting, the work, the computations are being done by cells exactly like that. Every sensation you've ever had, every dream, every thought, every feeling, every hope, everything is that. You're looking at it. And that's the mystery of consciousness in a nutshell. The sensation you're having right now, trying to decide if whether what I'm saying is true or not, that sensation is that. How do those subjective, private, inner experiences result from or emerge from, or whatever the word is, from that? No one knows, but it's the coolest question in the world to me, and it's going to be part of the subject of what we're going to talk about today. And that's the mystery of consciousness. So here's what to expect from the next however many minutes. Candace, how long do I have? Like 45?
45.
Okay, perfect.
Or until you're tired.
What is consciousness? We just talked about that. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get into that too much. So for those of you that are familiar, we're not going to get to talk about cool ideas like, you know, physicalism versus dualism or epiphenomenology or any of that cool stuff. What we just got is pretty much all we're going to have time for. But from there, we're going to talk about 3 areas of cognitive neuroscience, which is my field: perception, emotion, and decision making. Conscious perception, conscious emotion experience, and conscious decision making. And we're going to ask ourselves along the way, what are some common objections that you hear a lot? Only humans consciously experience what they see or hear or touch. You hear that sometimes. Sometimes you hear that only humans consciously experience emotions. You hear that sometimes. Sometimes you hear that only humans make conscious or free or rational or moral decisions. You hear those kinds of things sometimes, and I'm going to present to you evidence along the way that none of those objections really fit the data very well. From there, we'll have a brief discussion about implications. So that's what's coming up. Before we get started, I want to make two quick notes that we won't have time to cover in depth, and well, you don't have to take my word for it, but I'll suggest it. Sometimes you hear people say that grammatical or formal or syntactic language, the kind us humans use, is required for consciousness. That doesn't seem to be the case. So various aphasias, which is just a fancy word for problems with your brain, various problems with your brain can impair or eliminate language in humans. So if I have brain damage of a particular kind, I can have problems with incoming language, so I might not be able to decode the language that's coming in, and or I can have problems outputting language. I can understand you, but I can't produce language of my own. One or both of those things can happen. Another common objection that you hear is that in order to be a conscious creature, you must know that you know. The fancy word for that is metacognition. I must be able to know that I'm knowing. Or I must be self-aware in the sense that I must know that I am a thing, above and beyond knowing about other things in the world. Those also don't seem to be the case. So human infants, up to approximately 4 fail measures of self-awareness. And then additionally, strokes in humans, this is bizarre, but it's true, can lead to people, it's hard to imagine, but there's people out there who will interact with you and they'll acknowledge you, they'll acknowledge most of the things all of us can acknowledge, except they don't experience them themselves, they don't experience themselves as existing. So they will deny up and down that they are a thing. It's a result of a particular kind of brain damage. It's really bizarre. You can Google it and watch videos of people who will say, I don't exist, I don't know what else to tell you. So it's hard to deny these people are in some sense conscious, suggesting that these other common objections don't hold. So for those of you that aren't familiar, like I said, my field is cognitive neuroscience, in case you don't know what that is. You can roughly think of neuroscience as the scientific study of the brain's machinery, where cells and axons are roughly equivalent to gears and wires in a machine. Cognitive science is the study of thinking and feeling and perceiving everything that we colloquially call the mind. And then you put those things together and you get cognitive neuroscience, which is the study of how the brain's machinery does the mind. So everything you hear is going to be from that perspective. So let's get started proper with perception. The question here is, do non-humans consciously see or hear or whatever? So perception has a precise meaning in psychology. It's by definition a conscious sensory experience. So if I'm perceiving something, you're perceiving me right now or your notes or whatever, that's a conscious sensory experience. It's sensory information and you're consciously experiencing it. That's what perception means. But it's different than processing. Right now, your brain is processing all sorts of information. It's monitoring homeostasis, it's making sure you don't tip over, it's modulating your attention, it's doing all sorts of stuff, but you're not perceiving that. That's just processing. We'll talk a little bit more about the distinction between processing and perception. But the point is, if an animal of any kind perceives something, then it is, sort of by definition, having a conscious experience of some kind. So, is there any evidence for that? Before I show you that, instead of just like rambling on and on for an hour, which is so boring, do me a favor and just stare at that center dot. For those of you that have a good angle, stare at the center dot on the left the whole time I'm talking, no matter what I say until I explicitly say otherwise. Just keep your eyes on that center dot. Someone just yell out what you see. It's not a trick question, it's pretty obvious.
A dot.
Someone else. Lines, colors,
contrast.
particular colors.
Purple, green, blue.
Yeah. So the projector's kind of funky. Hopefully this will work. But in a second,
Oh, green.
green. In a second, I want you to move your eyes from the dot on the left to the dot on the right. I promise there's nothing in the square on the right. On the count of 3, move your eyes. 1, 2, 3. Anybody see other colors? Anybody see red?
Red.
If you didn't, just try it again while I'm talking. But if you did, there's no red in this image. When you look over here, you consciously perceive red. That's what perception is. Let's try another one. This one might work better. Pick one of these beautiful faces, I don't care which one, and stare at that face and only that face the whole time I'm talking. Real quick, this is a blend. Just used a computer program to mash Scarlett and whatever that dude's name is.
Oh,
Faces together. It's a perfect 50-50 blend. Now, the whole time I'm talking, pick a face and just stare directly at that face. In a couple of seconds, after your brain does the stuff that it does, I'm going to switch back to the mix of faces. I promise that I didn't do anything. It's the same 50-50 blend of faces, but I have a suspicion that a lot of you are going to perceive something different this time around. So on the count of 3, just keep staring where you're staring. You don't have to move your eyes, and see what the face that pops up looks like. 1, 2, 3. Would that work for anybody? Someone who said, "Whoa, what did you see?" The other guy doesn't want to. No, just what did you see?
Well, I see a different, like I see Joaquin now.
Yeah, you were staring at Scarlett.
Right. And now I see completely just the man.
Right. So you perceived something different. The information is the same. The information that was going in was the exact same, but your conscious perception was different. Hopefully that worked for some of you. And it's the exact same face. It's a process called adaptation. It happens in your brain in lots of different ways. The details don't really matter for us. But remember back to when you were looking at the color field of color. So here's like a 20-second rundown of what happens in your brain. Information comes in, and it's received by cells that are tuned to receive it. That's their job, that's what they do. That information is then transformed, just like it is in your laptop. It's turned into a slightly different form of that information, and it's output to a different part of your brain. A different part of your brain that's tuned to receive that. That information is transformed again, and it's outputted to yet another part of your brain that's tuned to receive that. This whole time, you were just looking at color. You're probably looking at color now. This is happening right now, but this is not perception. This is just processing. As this is happening, you are not perceiving. This is just your brain processing information. It's only not until later that you actually perceive the information. So the message is that perception requires processing. In order to consciously perceive something, you must process the information first, but they're not equivalent. They don't mean the same thing. So our question is not, do non-human brains process information? The answer to that question is unambiguously yes. It's like asking if non-human stomachs digest food. Yes, that's what stomachs are built to do. That's the kind of machine that it is. Non-human animal brains process information. We definitely know that much. Our question is slightly different. It's, do non-human animal brains consciously perceive information? So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of stimuli that sometimes researchers use to try and answer that question. So on the left there, it's just a brief video, but most of you probably see, on average, can you kind of see that? On average, no coherent movement. There's a bunch of dots, they're all sort of doing random crap. in general, the blob isn't moving in any particular direction. In contrast, most of you probably perceive motion on that second one, slight motion to the right. So, here's a macaque monkey, often used in research like this. Here's the macaque monkey's brain. He's facing to the right to orient to. They can be trained to participate in experiments where they tell you what those blobs are doing, if they're moving, and if they are, in what direction they're moving. When they do that, they use parts of their brains called MT, doesn't matter what it's called, but it's here. It's actually there in your brain as well. Same region, same area of the brain, same kinds of cells. And those cells in both of our brains are arranged in a really particular way. So these gray columns, you can see each one represents a cell, basically. This cell responds to leftward motion. This cell responds to rightward motion. This cell responds to down left motion. This cell up right motion. This cell responds to downward motion, and this red cell responds to upward motion. So if you go into a macaque's brain and you stimulate the up cell, and then you ask that macaque, when he's looking at the noisy glob that doesn't appear to move in any particular direction, you ask him what direction is that blob moving, he will respond with a button press. He will respond up. I see upward motion. So you might think maybe stimulation of this particular cell in MT is just causing him to do this. Right? It's not causing him to consciously perceive motion, rather it's just causing him to press the up button. But the cells responsible for doing this are in a different part of the brain, and those cells aren't being stimulated. So already we have fairly compelling evidence of a non-human animal having a conscious experience of some kind, and in this case it's relatively simple. It's just a conscious experience of upward motion because we tickled the correct cell. But so far not bad. So far so good. Yes, that makes sense. Okay, so if you, most of you have probably seen this, but if you haven't, ask yourself, what corner of this cube is the red dot on? Is it on the corner of the cube that's closest to you, or the corner of the cube that's farthest away from you? Whatever it is, in a couple seconds, or a handful of seconds, it's going to flip. It flipped. Okay, cool. So if it started out in the corner farthest away from you, eventually it will flip, and all of a sudden it'll look like it's on the corner closest to you. This is called an ambiguous figure, and that flip is called a perceptual flip. What's interesting is that when it flips, nothing about the input has changed. The input into your brain is exactly the same. The only thing that's different is perception. So sometimes researchers use a similar get-up to study stuff like this. So this is somebody from the top down, in case my PowerPoint skills aren't as good as I feel like they are. And they're staring at a screen. Between their eyes is some divider or some fancy set of mirrors to ensure that whatever appears on one side of the screen goes into one eye and one eye only, and whatever appears on the other side of the screen goes into the other eye and the other eye only. This method is called binocular rivalry. So you're getting a face, in this example, into one eye, and a house into the other eye. And the question is, what do you perceive? Do you see some weird mix of the two? Do you somehow see both of them at once? It's hard to imagine, but are they like overlaid on each other? What happens? And the answer is that you consciously perceive a face, and then it flips, just like the cube. You'll see a house, and then it'll flip, just like the cube. You'll see a face again, and it'll flip back and forth like that. You can track those changes in the brain. So again, it doesn't really matter what they're called, but there's areas of the brain that are sensitive to faces, respond to faces, and sort of exclusively only faces. And there's area of the brain that respond to places, like houses. And as that flip happens, that perceptual flip back and forth from face to house, activity in those two areas of the brain correlate, or track. Here's a zoomed in view of that same data. So let's say you're in that weird fancy setup where you're perceptually flipping between house and face. I'm tracking the house and face areas of your brain. Perceptual flip happens and FFA, the face area, is active. And vice versa, if you're consciously perceiving a house, PPA is active. Now, nothing impressive so far, really, but here's what happens, for example, right now, like at this instant. As you're seeing that, that's what's happening in your brain. Every time I flip back and forth, if I flip to a face, your FFA is active. If I flip to a house, your PPA is active. What that means is, the take-home point, is that these areas in the brain aren't just processing information. They reflect or are correlated with actual conscious perception. If your FFA is active under those, those circumstances, you are consciously experiencing a face. So the cells that do that, the conscious experience of faces, are here in humans and in monkeys. These brains are facing to the left. This area in general is called the temporal cortex. It's where face-sensitive cells live in all primates, including us. Monkeys, those macaques or rhesus, or different species, can be trained to do what you just did, or what you just pretended to do, be in that binocular rivalry experiment. They can be trained to tell you when their perception flips from face to house to face to house. And they're using the same cells to do it, and the time course of their perceptual flips is extremely similar to humans. So this is a recurring theme you're going to hear over and over, but they behave as if their conscious experience is comparable or similar to ours, or at least present. And the neural correlates for those conscious experience, as we understand them, are present. But it's not just primates. Rats can recognize fearful expressions on other rats using cells in their temporal cortex. Dogs have face-sensitive cells in their temporal cortex, and sheep can discriminate among faces, most likely using cells in face-sensitive cells in their temporal cortex. So right now, I think it's super cool, but you might be saying, okay, we're talking about seeing things consciously. What about something a little more tactile? What about pain? So let's say part of this presentation was you come up and I hit you in the hand with a hammer. It's not, but let's say it was. You would retract your hand. This took like an hour. At least two things have happened when that part of the presentation comes up. The behavioral response, and then the conscious experience of pain, the actual experience of suckiness. Descartes, for example, suggested, of course all animals have this. All organisms, even single-cell organisms, have this, the withdrawal. But Descartes suggested, for example, lots of others, even some people embarrassingly more modern, suggest that this is all they have. They're just response robots. They don't have this. This is exclusive for humans. So, in humans, surprise, surprise, we don't know exactly how the conscious experience of pain happens, but there is a rough network of brain areas that come up again over and over when human is subjectively experiencing pain. It doesn't matter what they're called, and I can bore you with the names, but I'll give you an idea of what those areas do. So under the scalp, under the the cortex, kind of deeper in the brain, an area that's associated with subjective pain, are places that are responsible for really basic functions, just being awake and breathing, that kind of stuff, but that also serve as sort of like a grand central station in the brain. Wires tend to converge there and diverge from there. That area is consistently implicated. Another area that's consistently implicated are areas that both execute your movement and plan your movement. And then areas that help decide how important some stimuli is, how relevant it is, and also detect errors. Those areas are consistently implicated. And as we'll talk about more later, decision-making areas in the brain. All of these, this very rough network of brain regions and functions are implicated in human subjective pain. So, how do non-human brains handle painful inputs? Turns out, really analogously, the same functional areas are implicated in non-human animal brains. So areas that do our basic functions and that sort of relay station function, or areas that do movement planning and execution, salience assessment, and decision-making areas. So this sort of like converging evidence led a National Research Council committee to suggest that all vertebrates, not just mammals, but vertebrates, likely experience pain. And they don't just mean, like Descartes did, that they do this and withdraw. They also mean consciously experience. So that was perception. A summary. Non-human animals certainly act as if they're having conscious perceptual experiences. Descartes got at least that part right. But, as you'll hear me say over and over, the neural structures related to conscious experience or responsible for conscious experience are also present across species. And like we talked about before, if any animal is having a conscious sensory experience, then they are in some sense conscious. So you might think like, you might still be a little unimpressed, or think, what about something a little more seemingly human? What about emotion? Do non-human animals consciously experience emotion? So emotion is often thought by emotion researchers to include the conscious feeling itself. So when emotion researchers call something an emotion in humans, they are referring to the physiological changes, the brain activity, and the conscious experience itself. And another important note before we get into it is that emotion and cognition aren't two separate things in the brain. There's not like an emotion center and a reasoning center in your brain. It's not wired up like that. The two are really, I mean, you tug on one wire and I guarantee you're tugging on the other. So you can't really do emotion and cognition one without the other. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Oh, and then just kind of a side note, affect. If I use the word affect, it's just out of habit, but that's like a more inclusive word for emotion. You can just think of it as a synonym for emotion. So let's talk about fear real quick. So what happens in your brain when you experience fear? So let's say there's a snake, you see the snake, and you feel fear. What's happening in your brain? Under the surface of your brain, that little yellow dot called the amygdala, I guarantee you, when you feel fear, I guarantee you your amygdala is flipping out. Likewise, if through brain damage or stroke or just a congenital defect or something, if you don't have an amygdala or it's damaged, you see that same snake. You do not experience fear. Even if, intellectually, you know this is a threat and I probably should be feeling fear, without an amygdala, you cannot experience fear. So a short list of non-humans with an amygdala is mammals. It's not really a short list, but you can summarize it in one word. And a short list of non-humans that have homologous structures, evolutionarily comparable structures that evolve for the same function and can work in the same way. Birds and fish, suggesting that the neural substrates necessary to consciously experience fear are present across species. So if you're an emotion researcher, or if you have ever talked to an emotion researcher or read that stuff, you know the name Panksepp. So this is a little thing from Panksepp.
As we have listened to animals playing, we have heard what appeared to be the sounds of laughter. And we studied these for a couple of years without quite understanding that this might be laughter. And then one day we decided to tickle some animals. And we realized that we had to look at the sounds at a very different register than we can hear. So we obtained these transducers that are called fact detectors that can bring very high frequencies down to our auditory range. We could tickle animals and generate a lot of vocal activity that appears to be laughter. These animals would begin to enjoy our company, and they would start to play with our hands, and wherever we would put our hands, they would follow it. And when we tested these animals to ask whether they were enjoying this kind of activity, the unambiguous answer was yes.
So, Panksepp, I don't know how to say his first name. I think it's Jaak. Is it Jaak? Okay, Jaak Panksepp. His idea, one of his ideas, one of his many, is that what we call emotions, happiness, sadness, grief, are built to engender evolutionarily beneficial responses for an organism, and that those emotions rely on particular neural substrates, and those substrates are common across multiple species. In the example he's talking about here, rats. So, just in case you're thinking that there's something special about human emotion, that it functions somehow fundamentally different than it might for other organisms, how does it function? Sometimes when people have like really bad seizures, super severe, the only way that doctors know right now how to help is to go in there and actually mess with brain stuff physically. And sometimes when they, it's weird, but it's true, sometimes when they do brain surgeries, they ask the person, hey, do you mind being part of a research study? And we might do a couple extra things. You'll probably be okay. And sometimes people say, okay. So this is an example. This woman was having brain surgery, and while they were doing that, the researchers stimulated a particular part of her frontal lobes around there, doesn't matter. But when they did, she laughed. And they stimulated it more, and she laughed harder, like gut laughter, what the researchers called extreme mirth. No one actually talks that way, of course, except for maybe those guys, I don't know. But more important than her actual behavior was the internal experience she reported. She reported feeling, consciously, mirth, I guess, humorous joy, or whatever the right words are. That area is called nucleus accumbens. It's an area that's consistently implicated in emotions. It's kind of tucked underneath the temporal lobe here. Again, it doesn't really matter, but the area and the function that it serves seems to be common across multiple species, and it's the neural substrate that, in part, supports the conscious experience of, in this case, happiness. So here's some examples of other emotions in the human brain. Purple means activity goes down, red means activity goes up. The point is, you can see that, like I was saying before, there's no emotion center. It sort of happens everywhere, all over the place, a wide network of cortical regions and subcortical regions that are involved in consciously experiencing emotion. It's more true for some than others. So fear is a little more centralized, but you can see there's other stuff involved too. So this basic brain architecture is certainly certainly common across species, and it's part of what led Panksepp to come to the conclusion that the actual experience of emotion is not limited to human brains. An important note is that, let's say those rats weren't laughing, or let's say I tickle you and you don't laugh. That doesn't, we probably have to have like 2 or 3 more talks. But that doesn't mean that you're not experiencing emotion, right? For example, in humans, autistic children often don't have the same outward responses to stuff. They might not laugh, they might not smile, but research suggests that that doesn't mean they're not experiencing emotion. Okay, so you might think like, all right, we've talked about kind of basic stuff, fear, happiness, stuff like that. But what about something a little more complicated, something that it's hard to feel on your own, that you sort of need other people for? Stuff like jealousy, envy, grief, stuff like that. Sometimes people call those social emotions. And again, an area of the brain that's consistently implicated is right here, above the bridge that links the 2 halves of your brain together, called the cingulate gyrus, or the cingulate cortex. This area in particular is consistently implicated in envy and jealousy in humans. So here is an MRI of an orca whale brain. If you cut my head in half from ear to ear like this and just sort of looked at my brain flat on, that's what you would be looking at, except that's an orca's brain, not mine. So the area that we were just talking about, the cingulate cortex that's implicated in social emotions in humans, is right here for orcas. So you'll notice 2 things. A, they have one, and B, it's huge. It's much bigger than humans, even controlling for the fact that they're much bigger animals. It's also not just physically bigger, it's more densely populated with cells, and it's more densely interconnected, hooked up to other parts of the brain than it is in humans. Another interesting example is that parental bonding in humans, so when a mom and her child emotionally bond, that's scaffolded, at least in part, on a chemical called oxytocin in the human brain. And Panksepp has some other cool work where separation distress between birds, between bird offspring and bird mothers, can be reduced by applying or giving oxytocin, just like it can in humans. Again, the sort of take-home message being that the neural architecture that supports human conscious experience, even of complicated stuff like grief and envy, is present across species. So that was emotions. A quick summary of that is conscious experience of all emotions in your brain require, you gotta have a brain. That's basically what that means. Non-human animals certainly act as if they're having emotions. Again, Descartes got that part right. But the neural structures that are involved in the conscious experience of emotion are present, or functional homologs of them are present across species as well. So there's good reason to suspect that non-humans consciously experience emotion, even complicated ones like grief or jealousy and stuff like that. So this is the part where we bring out the big guns and we think like, fine, non-human animals can maybe do that stuff, but certainly they can't make conscious decisions. So maybe only humans have free will. We do have free will, right? We'll talk about that for a second. And then we'll talk about the way we make decisions in general. Can we make decisions that are rational or free from emotional content? And then do non-humans make decisions like that? And then we'll finally talk about human moral decision making. how we do it, and whether or not other animals might do it also. So decision-making, free will. This is a quick summary of a bunch of studies. There's old versions and there's modern versions. I just did my best to summarize them. So what does it feel like? It feels like, this is what it feels like to me. I decide something and then I do it. It's not that complicated. You scientists are so annoying, making things complicated. But what if it's not actually that simple? So here's a kind of summary of what happens in a typical experiment like this. Someone will be looking at a screen, and on the center of the screen, a series of letters will appear. K will appear in the middle, then T, D, Q, V, one right after the other. And I tell you, whenever you freely decide, press either the right or the left button. So let's say you do this experiment, and here, when V is on the screen, you press a button. You press R in this case. And then I ask you, what letter was on the screen when you consciously and freely decided to press that button? And you think, back here when D was on the screen, I decided to press the button, and then, it wasn't instantaneous. A little bit later, we know they actually pressed it. What about all this time beforehand? So I can watch your brain while it's doing an experiment like that. These are areas that are involved in decision making. Again, doesn't matter what they are. The pattern is the same across all of them, so we can just focus on one. This 0 point is when you actually press the button. That's when you physically press the thing. This red line is when you consciously experienced your decision to press the button. I freely made the decision right now at the red line, and then I actually physically press it at the 0 point. All this green stuff predicts not just the button press, but your subjective experience of making the decision in the first place, up to 5 seconds before you're ever aware of making the decision yourself. This has led some people, this is a contentious area, as I'm sure you guys are aware, but this has led some people to suggest that conscious will is a sensation that our brains deliver. It's not physical reality. So what about something a little more down to earth? Let's say your friend here on the left is asking you what she should do, and here's you, and you're thinking about it, and then you know. Well, the sensation that you know what she should do, whether or not you actually know, of course you probably don't, but that sensation of knowing itself, just the feeling of knowing, feels good. It recruits emotional systems in the brain, ones we just talked about. The fact that it feels good, the good feelingness of knowing, is information that your brain uses as input when it's trying to make a decision. Likewise, not knowing feels bad. If I don't know, that feels bad when I'm trying to make a decision. That feeling, the badness feeling, is input for my brain as it's trying to make a decision. So let's say you're by yourself and you ask yourself, should I do X, Y, or Z, whatever it is. In order to come to a decision, what does your brain do? It collects emotional information. It uses that emotional information as input, and then it delivers some decision. So you monitor and assess your internal emotional state every time you make a decision, no matter how goofy or asinine it is, your brain is doing this. It is assessing internal emotional information, and it's using that emotional information as input, along with other things, your pros and cons list and input from the environment, but it's part of the equation that your brain uses to deliver some decision. That whole process is not doesn't have to be conscious. In fact, most of the time it's not. You're not aware of the fact that you're weighting affective information from certain systems in your brain. It happens automatically. Non-human animal brains, how do they make decisions? So they assess information from their affective centers in their brain, systems in their brain, and they use that as input as they're trying to make a decision. Non-humans clearly behave as if they make decisions. They also have affective systems like we just talked about, and they use those affective systems, information from those affective systems, to help compute their decisions, just like we do. The point being, the take-home point being, all animal brains compile, assess, and weight, and weight different sources of information in order to make decisions. That's just sort of how animal brains make decisions. Okay. Sometimes people will say, like, okay, but there's like this one super amazing thing humans can do. It's like mythical. We build statues about it and put it on our dollar bills and stuff. And it's the ability to make moral decisions. It's the ability to decide what is good and bad, or right and wrong. It's so complex and symbolic, whatever that means, and subtle and nuanced and blah, 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 blah. So you guys might be familiar with an area of psychology called moral psychology. It's super cool. There's a ton of it, but this is a really cool example of a study from moral psychology. The message tends to be the same over and over. So let's say your friend again here asks you if it's wrong, morally wrong, to drive instead of walk to work, or to do it with your cousin, or marry your cousin, or to make controversial art. Is this morally wrong? You have to decide, is it morally wrong? And most of the time, you're just like, whatever. I mean, that's kind of gross, but wrong, who cares? Let's say they do it again, but this time in the room is a stink, like a bad smell. And they ask you the question. This time, your moral decision is going to be very drastically different. You are going to judge these things to be much more morally wrong than you would have had the smell been absent. What the crazy thing is you don't even need to know consciously the smell is there. You don't need to be aware of the smell. If you are aware of the smell, chances are you're going to tell me up and down, what does that have to do with my ability to reason morally? You're going to deny the fact that the smell had an effect on your moral decision making. This has led, well, it's amazing because, you know, one of these like most fundamental feeling and important human abilities, the ability to make moral decisions, can literally be as fickle as a wafting fart. This has led some people to suggest that the emotional dog wags the rational tail, meaning that when humans make moral decisions, our affective systems are responding first. They're sort of driving the initial reactions, and the reasoning, the cognitive stuff is often rationalizations that come after the fact. Again, point being, big take-home point being, that we're not really aware of how we make decisions. My brain is not built with the stuff needed to know consciously how it's making decisions. It just doesn't come with those wires. Dogs, primates, elephants, dolphins, they display manners, they display concern for fairness and forgiveness. Chimps and all primates, really, I guess not some are pretty solitary, but the social ones police their social groups for violations of social norms, which should sound pretty familiar. Humans are obsessed with doing this. Elephants and primates like to cooperate. Elephants, primates, and dolphins display empathy. Dolphins, whales, and elephants and primates appear to mourn. So again, it's important to make the distinction. It's not just that they're making moral decisions. As we talked about before, the architecture to experience moral emotions is also present, at least in some species. So a quick decision-making summary. Non-humans certainly make decisions. Humans definitely make decisions about unique things. So you're never going to find a non-human that is making a decision about their mortgage or how often to vote against Trump or whatever. But the fundamental computations are quite similar across species. And then when it comes to humans, these things that we feel are really special and sacred, maybe they are, but they aren't what they appear to be. They don't work the way it seems like they work from our point of view. Conscious decision-making itself, causally, may be an illusion. The safest statement is that animal brains make decisions. So in sum, there's good evidence to believe that non-humans consciously perceive the world. There's good evidence to believe that they consciously feel emotion and even consciously make complex decisions. There's no such thing as a brain with free will and a brain without free will, at least not as far as we can tell. So we might not know exactly what it's like to be a non-human, but it does seem to be like something. Something that involves perception, conscious emotion, and decision making. So some implications. What are some implications? The ethical implications are pretty profound, I think. For consciousness in particular, what does this tell us? A lot of people have suggested that consciousness is not a yes or no proposition. It's not a light switch that's either on or off. It's a spectrum of some kind. I personally am not sure how to make sense of that. What does it mean to move up or down the spectrum? How do we measure that? Is it just 2 dimensions, or can you move in? That's not clear, but it's an interesting idea. And then, what about differences between human and non-human consciousness? So maybe one species has conscious experience that's more or less rich or robust than another species. A, what does that mean, rich and robust? And B, we have to keep in mind that that can likely vary within humans too. So presumably, if this is true, if things vary in richness and robustness, a small child is going to have a less rich or robust conscious inner life than an adult, or a mentally brain damaged person or a mentally disabled person might have a more or less rich or robust conscious experience than a healthy adult. So we have to keep in mind that it can vary within a species, not just across species. But I don't know, I would like to hear what you guys' thoughts are. This is what makes me think about, are there any implications for non-biological consciousness? I think so, but I would love to hear your ideas. This is me. I'm here at Denver. If you ever want to talk about consciousness, I'm obsessed in probably an unhealthy way. And I also teach an undergraduate course on consciousness at DU, where we get to look at some of these cool topics in a little more detail. That's it, guys. Thanks.
We have some time for questions. Elric, do you want to moderate yourself? Or?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
Thanks for a really fascinating presentation. And I think I'm going to ask what might be a really unfair question,
Okay.
but because it's almost a disciplinary question. You say you're interdisciplinary, so I'm hoping that you'll welcome it.
Okay.
One of the sorts of presumptions that I was struck by while you were talking is that consciousness seems to be located in the brain, right? And I think that presumption has been challenged by folks in feminist theory, for example, feminist Elizabeth Wilson, who argues that the gut thinks as well. And her argument is that the thinking done by the gut demonstrates that there's an extended mind, so it's not just the body is operating, but that the mind is not necessarily seated in the brain. The presumption has been challenged by people in critical animal studies, holding up animals such as the octopus, for example, which shows a form of what the political theorist Stephanie Eric calls a distributed intelligence. where there's intelligence throughout the body, and it's not just located in a centralized brain. And then for those who would look at like plants, for example, like you can take a patch of grass and if there's a fire started on one side, that sets off chemical processes which demonstrate some sort of way of processing and reacting to stimuli that don't require something like a brain, right? And so I'm not asking you to justify neuroscience, but you know, I guess my question is, alongside beginning with a particular definition of consciousness and then going out into the world beyond to see whether or not non-human animals abide by or are analogous to those definitions, I'm wondering if there's anything, you know, that you come across in your research or your research beyond neuroscience that looks to the external world for ways in which our notions of consciousness may be challenged, expanded, and enriched.
Yeah, great. That's a great question. Thanks, man. I'm familiar with some of that, the research about gut stuff. So it is the case that, I mean, there's neurons in your gut, there's neurons in your skin, there's neurons all over the place, not just your brain. It is the case that there's some research about changing the particular ratio of bacteria in guts can actually have an effect on behavior. So it was with rats, the stuff I'm familiar with, and humans. But if you give or take the right or wrong amount of bacteria, you can have things like people or rats that persevere for longer or less long in a difficult challenge. So if like I ate the right probiotics or whatever, if I changed my gut stuff, I might persist in a challenge for longer than if I hadn't have changed my gut stuff. And it's fascinating and it's really interesting. I think that my understanding is that the change in behavior or cognition, or both, happens only to the extent that activity in the brain is modulated by fiddling with my gut. So there's this thing called the vagus nerve. It goes from my gut basically directly to my brain. There's very few interruptions. It's a pretty major highway. And it delivers information about the status and activity of my gut to my brain. So when you fiddle with stuff in there, you might change the way I think, how easily discouraged I am or whatever. But you're only doing so to the degree that you've altered my brain in some way through, in this example, the vagus nerve. What was the other thing? Oh, octopi. They certainly do have brains. They are different. They're structured very different from human brains. If I'm not right, if I'm right, they don't have two lobes like most mammals. They have one associated with each. This. So it's not like there's no brain in there. There's certainly a brain or a set of brains or something. Yeah, those are my thoughts on that question. But yeah.
Okay. Good. That's very interesting. Yes, thank you for presenting. My question is hopefully fairly simple. I want to know what the control was for the experiment with people and gases and morals, because, well, for one, I do not want to believe that when I'm arguing for the ethical truth of something, it's because of the smell of the rib.
Yeah.
But also, I'm trying to struggle to see how, if you ask a person a set of questions and they answer one way, and then you ask them again later, how there's what controls do you have from that first experience of them answering affect the other?
Right. So that second half is they don't ask the same person twice, because you're right. That's how would you figure? I mean, the person obviously remembers the question, and this time you guys like farted, so this is we mess it all up. So they just get a bunch of people, and you know, half of them have the smell, half of them don't. And the assumption is that when you get a big enough group of people, any systematic differences are spread equally between the two groups. So yeah, they're not asking the same person repeatedly. And then what was the first half again?
Just the controls in general.
Oh, the controls. Yeah, I don't remember actually off the top of my head what the control group for that experiment was, but if you want to know, I would be really happy to send you those papers or other really cool papers, because moral psychology is super fascinating, man. If you're interested in ethics and stuff, you might really enjoy that stuff in general.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Hi. Yes.
So you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that consciousness is kind of an area that we share between philosophy and neuroscience. And I suspect I know your answer to this, but do you consider those two things to overlap completely, or is there a sort of a Venn diagram where philosophy answers questions that neuroscience can't? And my suspicion when I was listening to your talk about perceptions and emotions is that the evidence that we have so far are all sort of involuntary stimulus. But are we able to account for consciousness in any kind of, let's call it like a spontaneous, active, intentional way that doesn't rely on those kinds of processes?
Can you give me an example of what you mean?
Yeah, so, you know, if you think about, like, let's say an experience with an artwork, and when you observe what the artwork is depicting, on the one hand, you can look at that artwork as depicting something that you take to be real, but you can sort of spontaneously shift out of that and, let's say, just become disinterested in whether it exists. And that shift itself doesn't seem to have any, I'm not sure if that lights up a part of the brain, or if it's rather this kind of spontaneous act of consciousness in such a way that, you know, consciousness might be able to describe in like a kind of non-embodied way. A non-embodied way.
Oh, okay.
As spectacular as that might be, is that something that philosophy can answer for us, or is that without it wrong?
Well, I mean, part of the reason I wanted to do this with the philosophy department is because I think for most questions, maybe, but especially for questions like this, where it's right on the edge. I mean, it's right on the edge of what we can even formulate as a question, much less understand. I think it's so important to have collaboration between people who think about what things mean and what the results imply, what they don't imply, and the actual scientists. So I don't know if there's questions that only one field can uniquely answer, but I think the collaboration is super important. And then one thing that has come up in neuroscience research over and over is that attention in the brain. So right now, I'm attending to you, and I'm also conscious of you. And that happens over and over. What I'm attending to, I'm conscious of. What I'm attending to, the art, I'm attending to the art, I'm conscious of the art. I'm not attending to the art, all of a sudden I'm not conscious of it anymore until I remember it and attend to the memory and everything. So relatively early in, 80s, 90s, people thought maybe it's just the same thing. Maybe what does attention in the brain is also doing consciousness in the brain, and we're making a big deal out of nothing. And a lot of research has gone into answering that question, and it's unambiguously the answer is attention and consciousness are certainly go together most of the time, but they are absolutely not the same thing in the brain. So that's what your example made me think of. I'm not sure if that's really getting at what you're asking, but we can talk about it.
Are you familiar with any studies that might focus, which this is probably across fields as well, on like imagination and the ability to kind of picture in your mind something that either does exist and you haven't seen in person, or just doesn't exist and it's some new invention that's only in your mind? And like how that might work in a human versus non-human person?
I don't know the second part, what the differences or similarities in that process are across species, but I do know some. So it's really crazy. You know how you guys looked at the faces and you adapted, and then later it looked different? Well, that can happen with lots of things, like motion. You know when you stare at a waterfall for a long time and then you look away and everything looks like it's moving up? It's the same idea. neurons in your brain are adapting to down, and when you look away, you see the opposite, you see up. But let's say you do that, right? Let's say you watch like a speed chase movie or something, and I ask you, how fast was the car going? And you imagine, you do what you're talking about, you picture it in your head, and you try and picture like, well, it went from here to here in this amount of time, so 80 miles an hour, and you estimate 80 miles an hour. And let's say you adapt, we do that again, except this time you adapt to motion. You've adapted to motion. And then I just ask you, do the exact same thing. Imagine the speed of the car. The fact that the neurons responsible for processing speed have adapted will actually affect your estimate, the mental image. You will imagine the car in your head to be faster or slower as a result just of adapting to unrelated motion. So it's another example of how like systems in the brain are just like, oh, it's like a mess under the desk of wires. It's all connected to everything else. It's kind of a nightmare in there. But that is certainly not unique to humans. Perceptual systems and higher order cognitive systems being interrelated. So. Yeah.
I had two questions. One was just about something that you said. So you said dogs recognize faces and dolphins. Do you mean dogs recognize dog faces, and are those facial recognitions like intraspecies every time? Is that?
Both.
Uh-huh.
For dogs, they can, I'm not sure about like sheep and stuff. I think that's just interspecies. But dogs obviously are, pretty highly evolved, co-evolved with humans. And for dogs at least, it's temporal cells for both dog and human faces.
Huh. Well, that's good to know. And the other thing I was going to ask you about was this not knowing feels bad. And I remember reading Robert Burton on feeling certain feels really good, so mathematicians are just high, right? Because they're like, boom, proof, done. And that feels great. But that also, given that sort of recursion, and seems to me that would make dogmatism feel very comfortable. Is that part of the implication of the claim that you're making when we make decisions morally, or we make decisions about something that we've already decided before, and we feel like we know what we're talking about because we live in echo chambers, or we only watch one TV channel, or whatever it is that we do? Yeah. Is that part of the sort of reinforcement for dogmatic points of view?
I think so. That's how I understand it. Yeah, is that if I'm, anti whatever social issue is bugging people, and you ask me, what are your feelings on that? I don't have to sort them. I don't have to reason every time. I have already affective information that can be delivered instantly, and I already know that. I know that. I know that's wrong or right, whatever. And yeah, a lot of times I can just repetitively, is that what you mean?
Yeah, because one of the things, for philosophers, right, those of us who teach particularly, thinking about teaching Plato, and Plato talks about how learning is so painful, and you have to pull people out of the cave, and right, all of that, and you have to change, and it seems to me that I'm thinking about somebody like my dad, or uncle in Tennessee or something, that would, they will hold their views, and they'll hold their views in the face of facts that fly in the face of everything they think.
Yeah.
But because, this is sort of where I'm seeing if we mesh, because the process of saying I don't know and changing and developing new views it's so painful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you think so?
Certainly, I think that's part of it, absolutely. You guys, I hate to break it to you, your guys' brains are a little weird. You guys, ask yourself questions and are unsatisfied with your own answers, and spend your careers doubting yourselves.
I had an engineer friend tell me, we're used to not having immediate gratification, but you guys never get gratification. I understand.
Thank you. I'm not sure exactly what I want to ask, but I heard you say towards the end, and I just wanted to begin by asking you this, that you were not perhaps satisfied with this idea that consciousness is a spectrum, or we should think of degrees of consciousness or something like that. So first thing is whether you were satisfied or not with that, or whether you were buying into the, yeah, there's a spectrum kind of thing. Is that, were you?
It certainly doesn't seem to be on-off. So
No, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, well, so it's kind of related to that. So it's because when I first, what we have is sort of, we know we are conscious, let's say. Let's start there, okay? And as you began with the question of like, maybe we don't even know whether we're conscious or not, or something like that. But at least phenomenologically, evidently I know I'm conscious, and I assume there's a room populated with other people who are like me, right? And so conscious like me, whatever I'm calling consciousness right now. And then, there's the interesting question of what's going on in my brain, right? When I'm perceiving you right now, and what's firing and all that stuff. And then, presumably, since I'm an animal, there are going to be animals that have the same kind of thing, right? And so I can say with confidence, they're probably conscious, like me, or something like that, right? But then I start going down, and I get to the ant, let's say, and I don't know what brains ants have, right? But they do seem to have processing, what you were calling processing. That is to say, they perceive stuff,
yes,
and they act in accordance to what they perceive, right? If I take an ant, I used to torture ants by sort of making them walk in a leaf and handing the other stuff and the other stuff and the other stuff, and it will go around in loops until it decided to jump, and it always happens. It always jumps at some point, right? It realizes I'm in some kind of island in space, and I need to take a leap of faith here and like jump into nothingness, and I'll land somewhere. Apparently, that's what's going on in the ant's brain. Is it conscious? I'm a little more hesitant to say it's conscious. I have no problem with apes are conscious to some extent. Yeah, all sorts of animals conscious. But when I get to the ant, when I get to the bacteria,
right.
They seem to be making decisions of some kind, maybe perceiving stuff. Plants, somebody mentioned, right? Also seem to be. But there I see. I want to say, if they're conscious, the consciousness they have is very removed from what I am now perceiving phenomenologically and calling consciousness, right? That's what I'm tempted to say, and that was what I thought. Oh yeah, But now, are you on board on that? And so, if you are, then. How do I know, or I mean, this is the unfair question, but it's the question of like, when is it off, right? When I start going down to the bacteria, at which point did I switch?
Yeah.
That's the kind of, and so, and what was missing in the brain?
It's a great question.
So we don't have an answer.
But,
obviously, right?
But, I mean, so like we talked about, like you said,
yeah.
Ants process information, plants process information.
Right.
My laptop processes
right.
information.
Thermometer.
An abacus processes
right.
information. All that stuff processes
right.
information. As far as I can tell, you also need a brain to stand any chance of perceiving that information, or a machine that functions like a brain.
Perceiving in the conscious way, you mean?
Perceiving consciously. Yeah. Processing information, my laptop and an abacus can do, or a calculator. But perceiving it takes a brain of a particular kind. The other question, I don't disagree with you. The spectrum explanation seems intuitive. Right. At some point there's none. At some other point there's lots. All I mean is that that's so ambiguous to me. Right. What is lots? How do you move up and down that spectrum? What's at the top? What's in the middle? I just mean it's ambiguous. I don't like. Yeah, that's all I mean.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Oh.
So consciousness is in between the mind and the brain. Like
Pardon?
they're intertwined, mind and brain. So what if you lose connection, like in severe cases of multiple sclerosis? Like what if you lose that connection between your mind and brain and you can't like perceive things like feeling or lose vision or hearing?
Yeah.
So are you still conscious if you can't, like your body literally can't, like, you can't work together?
Like if your brain gets cut off from the rest of you.
Yeah.
Get one of these, the old
Your mind can't connect to like certain neurons.
Yeah. So you're an interesting, what I hear you saying, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that there's your brain, that's a thing, and then there's your mind, and that's a thing. And sometimes...
But they like work together. What if that connection is like, what if your brain can't send signals to like, oh, I'm looking at a dog that's upset?
Right, so, well, your suggestion is maybe the brain and the mind are different things. That's philosophically, that's dualism. The method by which the mind, whatever that is, affects the brain and vice versa is a problem. People don't, if it is the case that the mind and the brain are two different things, the way in which those two different things, presumably one physical, the brain, the other non-physical, somehow the mind, the way that a non-physical and a physical system can interact isn't well understood. But the other part of your question that I think I hear you asking is, what if, like, I'm standing there and there's a face in front of me, but the little bits in my brain that do faces are broken. Am I conscious of that face? And the answer is no. No.
So then are you not conscious anymore?
Not of that face.
So you can be conscious towards particular things?
Yes, so you'll like this. So, imagine a tennis ball. I just throw a tennis ball. Remember how I talked about there's areas of your brain that do motion? That's the job. Cells there respond to motion, and that's it. As that ball is moving, those cells will be responding to the motion. There's other cells in your brain that do color, that lime green color. Those cells are correlated with color experience. Anytime you experience color, those cells are active. Anytime you experience motion, these cells are active. If I experience something that's moving and colored, I have one set of cells that are correlated with movement awareness, one set of cells that's correlated with color awareness. But of course, we don't experience the world that way. We don't experience, oh, look, there is a movement in addition to a color. We experience a moving colored ball. It's all meshed together. That's called the binding problem, and people don't understand very well how that works, how motion over here and color over here get meshed together to make a tennis ball, the conscious perception of a tennis ball. So yes, but you can mess with it. So you can mess with it by, say, destroying the cells that are responsible for motion, and then throwing the tennis ball and asking me what I see. And I will be consciously aware of a colored ball, but I will not be consciously aware of a moving colored ball. So you can actually tease apart the conscious perception of different features of stuff in the world. Yeah, back here.
I feel like the conscious spectrum is actually different for a lot of things based on animals versus people. I feel like whether we're trying to prove an umbrella level of consciousness isn't necessarily fair because animals base their consciousness off of survival. Humans base their consciousness off of individualistic needs and goals. Our mass consciousness is connected, but we're not working together. So when you're trying to prove consciousness, you're just looking at the individual, rather than such as a pack of wolves. Not one wolf makes a decision, oh, I'm going to go down to the watering hole, even though the rest of my pack has to move up the mountain. Not one wolf makes that decision. The pack leader makes that decision for all of the wolves and for all of the benefits. So I'm wondering if you believe that, as far as what I've written here, do you believe that the human race is working on a survival-based conscious or a survival subconscious? Are animals working on a survival-based conscious or a survival subconscious? That's the diverse spectrum.
Can you give me an example of what you mean by survival-based conscious or subconscious?
So survival-based subconscious would be less of a concentration of your needs, such as water, food, clothing, shelter. As people, we are distracted into this consumeristic idealism. And we're distracted away from what we need to do as a community to work together. So our conscious is more concentrated on our individualistic goals. Animals are more concentrated on survival goals for the entire pack. So do you think that that separation and that comparison would be enough to prove that there is a conscious spectrum?
Okay, I think I see what you're saying. So it certainly feels like the goals that I'm consciously pursuing are more complicated than my dog's, maybe. I gotta like iron my shirt today for the first time in 3 months because people are gonna look at me and, you know, trying to be blah, 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 talking about big fancy ideas and stuff. My dog is not doing that. She's maybe, her thoughts are maybe a little more basic, like, is it time for lunch yet? Or this is pleasant, or this is unpleasant. It does feel that way. I would challenge, like, I would challenge the idea that our conscious goals and thoughts and decisions and feelings are as complex, or are what they appear to be. Because like we just talked about, a lot of times, even something as complicated feeling as a moral reasoning cannot be what it appears to be. In fact, to more directly answer your question, a lot of work has shown that moral reasoning in humans suggests this, that moral reasoning in humans is a sort of, it's scaffolded on very basic things that are common across social primates certainly, and social mammals in general. So things like empathy and fairness and stuff like that are driven by evolutionary pressures. So even the things we think about as fair or unfair or kind or unkind are really scaffolded on evolutionary pressures that, you know, all species are subject to. But if you want, I can tell you about some of those articles later. Yeah.
We have a number of 3:30 classes, which is why you saw the faculty. And in fact, one of them is trying to have class in here and just waved me off. So can we thank our speaker?
Yeah.